on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. If you want to join us for the text chat, head over to TruthBrigade.com. And, of course, the number to call in tonight with your questions or comments is 512-879-3805. Our special guest tonight, Andrew D. Basiago, is going to be talking about the discovery of the life on Mars and quantum access, which is basically a fancy term for time travel. Welcome to the show, Andrew. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, Christie. Thank you for having me on.
Oh, wow. You have the most interesting bio and background I've ever read. And so much to talk about. We might have to do more than one show, but, I would love for you to talk about DARPA's time-space exploration back in the early 70s.
Well, It hasn't been widely publicized because it was one of the most highly compartmentalized, classified research and development programs that the U.S. Defense Department has ever undertaken. But beginning in around 1970, DARPA, which was alternately called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, and then later the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, had an incipient time-space program that was being developed in tandem with the space program that was being widely publicized, but was deeply compartmentalized and secret. Essentially, by 1970, the United States government had two technologies under development. The first was a teleportation-based time travel capability that resulted from technical secrets that were left in Nikola Tesla's papers when he died in January of 1943. They were forwarded after they were recovered by two War Department officers who reached Tesla's apartment in New York before the two FBI agents who were trying to seize his papers. They were then forwarded to the Los Alamos physics community, namely the world's leading physicists who were then gathering at Los Alamos to develop the atomic bomb. And that line of technical development continued for about a quarter century after Tesla's death, when in the 1967-68 time frame, it was discovered that one of the devices that was contained in his paperwork allowed for the physical movement of human beings in vortal tunnels that the device opened up literally in the fabric of time-space. This would kind of be the opposite of what was then being depicted on Star Trek. It didn't involve disintegrating the individual and then reassembling them elsewhere. That was impossible because that would kill somebody. Rather, it was creating a disequilibrium in the fabric of time-space, and the individual was traveling through a tunnel to another point on the surface of our planet. The other line of technical development that Project Pegasus was undertaking under DARPA derived from the works of two Vatican musicologists named Ernetti and Gemelli. These devices were called chronovisors. Recently, they've been referred to as looking glass technology. But in Project Pegasus, they were referred to by the name that Ernetti and Gemelli had given them, namely the chronovisor. The chronovisor was accidentally discovered by these two Vatican musicologists when they were studying the harmonic patterns in Gregorian chants in the 1940s. And in consultation with the distinguished Italian physicist Enrico Fermi, by the early 1950s, they had developed their accidental discovery of remote imaging of past events into an electro-optical device that could actually model holograms of past events. Now, I was brought into Project Pegasus initially in 1967-68 when I teleported with my late father, the aerospace engineer Raymond Francis Basiago, from the old Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Building in Woodridge, New Jersey, to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And then later, beginning in the fall of 1969, I was placed in a specialized learning program in New Jersey, and then involved in both teleporting back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico, and also participating as a child in the chronovision probes that were being undertaken during those years in New Jersey and New Mexico. This would be beginning in the fall of 1970, after we had had about a year of training. Now, the purpose of Project Pegasus was primarily intelligence gathering. It was hoped by the U.S. intelligence community and defense, the national security community, the U.S. Defense Department, that these technologies would allow the executive branch, namely the military-industrial intelligence complex, to gather information about past and future events that could then be used for contingency planning to protect the United States. So I found myself immersed in these incipient experiments in time-space exploration, beginning actively and substantially in the fall of 1969 as a third grader, and as an 8-year-old.
Wow. Amazing. So you actually traveled with this technology?
Yes, I first traveled with my dad from Curtiss-Wright to Santa Fe, and from there we traveled by car so that he could take part in a technical briefing with an official at the Los Alamos National Labs. Then several years later, after we were trained for much of 1969 and 70, we were regularly teleporting from Curtiss-Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey. Actually, I can give you the name of the building. It was in Building 68. And in the laboratory there in Building 68 stood essentially a device that was very simple, even elegantly simple. It basically consisted of two parenthesis-shaped booms across which was radiating a form of energy that Tesla discovered the way to derive from the universe itself. And this curtain of shimmering energy created an effect so that when you jumped through the energy, you found yourself traveling in essentially a vortal tunnel that had been opened up in the fabric of time-space, very similar to the near-death experience description of an illuminated tunnel. And we would then go through that for a second or two and then pop out to wherever we had been sent, which during the entire time I was attached to Project Pegasus was the state capitol complex in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They were sort of using that as a collection area. And then we would participate in different activities of one kind or the other in New Mexico, and then be driven to an identical lab at the Sandia National Labs, adjacent to Kirtland Air Force Base outside of Albuquerque, and then jump back to the tarmac at Curtiss-Wright. So we were doing that quite frequently, without, at least ostensibly, without injury at that time. There were a couple of mishaps when I was attached to the project. For example, one time, one of the other children arrived in New Mexico standing in a kind of a catch basin or public fountain that had about 3 inches of water in it. And as a result, his feet arrived in New Mexico after he did, and he sort of slid off his ankles.
Wow.
And lost his feet. But we were doing it, without injury for a substantial number of jumps back and forth during the 1969 to 72 time frame. Now, when we started doing it as a group of child trainees, beginning in summer of 70, we began to detect that we were spending a lot of time in New Mexico, even until the sun went down, until it was dusk, and then we were being driven up to Sandia and jumping back to New Jersey, and finding that we were arriving there, let's say, at 11 a.m. of the morning that we had left New Jersey. And so we asked some of the program functionaries, are you moving us around in time? And they confirmed indeed that they were, and that at that time, in summer of 69, fall of 70, they were able to move us 12 hours back in time. But then, of course, as we began to teleport more frequently back and forth between New Jersey and New Mexico, sometimes there were adjustments of days, weeks, and months. So I estimate that I spent probably about an extra year in New Mexico cumulatively in the process of teleporting there and then teleporting back to New Jersey.
Wow. Amazing. So
in fact,
you have an extra. So you lived an extra year. I mean, did they bring you back to the time frame that you originally started at?
Right. They were doing precisely that. They were creating time loops. So, for example, we would teleport to New Mexico and spend time there being trained in some aspect of the program. And that could go on. It could just be an afternoon, or sometimes there were several seminars that lasted several weeks. I spent a number of summers there. But then we were apprised of the fact before we were taken to Sandia of how long we had spent in New Mexico, and we were sort of psychologically prepared for the fact that we were then going to be teleporting not just back to New Jersey, but back to New Jersey about an hour before we had originally left. So by creating these loops, they were able basically to disguise our participation, to camouflage our or conceal rather our participation in the program. And they were also able to enable us to teleport from our position in time-space in New Mexico and then loop back to New Mexico and then ultimately loop back to New Jersey on the day we had originally left. So they were creating basically time-space loops within time-space loops, both to involve us in the early days of time-space exploration, but also to conceal our project activities from our our mothers. My father obviously knew because he was one of the project engineers, but from our family members, our friends at school, and so forth. So wow. I was kind of being brought along in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade of school, essentially by the cult of intelligence, essentially by being immersed in a secret defense project, a project which, in fact, Donald Rumsfeld, who would go on to become defense secretary under 2 U.S. presidents, was the defense attaché for. We were interacting with some of the Manhattan Project scientists and really out there on the frontier of applied quantum physics in the 20th century. So I've spent about the last 10 years rather meticulously going back and investigating my experiences, and I now have the material for a rather lengthy account of what was achieved by Project Pegasus and what it was like to be a child immersed in these early forays in time-space exploration.
Amazing. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Dr. Claude Swanson, but he says it's actually well known that we can move backward and forward in time. He put a book together called The Synchronized Universe that details some of the evidence and research into this phenomena.
Yes, I mean, there's no question that essentially time travel emerged in 1967-68 when Defense Department engineers working with prototypes of devices found in Tesla's papers that the Defense Department had no idea what they achieved. It was accidentally discovered that they created these vortal tunnels. What actually happened was they constructed one of the prototypes from his drawings and schematics and propagated the energy field, but they had absolutely no idea what the energy field did or what it was. And wow. One of the project engineers walked through the energy field to try to retrieve a screwdriver that was sitting on one of the lab desks across the laboratory there at Curtis Wright, and found himself falling through a vortal tunnel and popping out in Africa. And it took him, I can't recall, it was either 6 weeks or 6 months to get back to the United States. And when he appeared at the door of the shop, his supervisor practically had a heart attack because he thought that his colleague had been disintegrated by the device. In fact, he had been teleported to Africa. And so
wow, and that was an accident.
Well, they accidentally discovered what Tesla's device did because apparently he hadn't identified it as a time travel device. So it was that accidental discovery of the time travel capability that Tesla had left with his paperwork.
How long did it take him to find this guy in Africa?
Actually, he found his way back to the East Coast. He essentially, I guess, negotiated with the Africans that he found himself among and got, I guess, from the village level to the governmental level and was able to get back to the United States. So that was the accidental discovery of this quantum access capability that Tesla had left in his paperwork. And in fact, it was that the emergence of that secret technical capability for which the Philadelphia experiment cover story was scripted. The Philadelphia experiment is essentially a psyop that was scripted by the Office of Naval Intelligence to de-link 3 critical facts, namely Nikola Tesla, teleportation, and the Los Alamos physicists. In fact, Tesla's papers are still at the Los Alamos National Labs, and you need a special security clearance from the Department of Defense even to read his paperwork, much less see the schematics or one of these devices in action. But the significance of my account, which is a true account, and I've painstakingly investigated my experiences in Project Pegasus, the significance is that the United States government has had a time travel capability since the 1967-68 time frame and has been actively moving people around from different points in time-space since around 1970.
Wow. And we did have Dr. Larry Babcock on the show and says that he has the math and all of the scientific proof you would need to actually make this or a reality. I don't know. I'm still waiting for him to build it in his garage. I want to go to Africa. But
I think one of the big issues in the disclosure movement is that really revolutionary technical advances like this have emerged in the context of experimentation in applied quantum physics carried out in a secret context by the U.S. Defense Department. And so that different scientists and engineers really have not had access to this information, and hence they're often working along on parallel tracks where they believe, for example, that something hasn't been achieved yet. And that deprives science and engineering in general from really accelerating the development of these devices and applying them socially. I mean, essentially, since 1970, we've been living in a world where individuals could jump through a device at Grand Central Station in New York, let's say, and pop out at Union Station, Los Angeles in several seconds, preventing all of those greenhouse gases from entering the atmosphere.
Well, obviously this technology is being suppressed, and the unfortunate fact of the matter is anyone that has experience in this or builds similar devices or proves the free energy and all of this, space and time travel, they're clearly ostracized at minimum from the profession.
Yes, and I think a lot of the individuals who philosophize about time travel, both in the mainstream media and in the alternative media, I think there's the a priori assumption that they're operating on the cutting edge of science.
Andrew, hold that thought. We're going to break right now, but we will be right back here on Truth Brigade. You're listening to Truth Brigade Radio on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. If you want to join us for the text chat, head over to TruthBrigade.com. And if you have any questions, feel free to give us a call, 512-879-3805. Our special guest, Andrew Basiago. Andrew, this is just simply amazing. I also want to mention you were the editor of Alfred Weber's book, Exopolitics, and you have a ton of research and information on exopolitics.com. We're going to be talking about some of that tonight, but if you could just briefly fill us in, you were talking about your experience. This is back in elementary, junior high school days. Can you briefly give us an idea of what happened from then until you edited the book Exopolitics and then started printing your research?
Boy, my experiences in Project Pegasus essentially spanned the fall of 1969 to the spring of 72. And at that time, the U.S. Defense Department was essentially experimenting in developing a quantum access capability. And by quantum access, I mean essentially the capability to gather information from distant locations in time-space by, for example, using human psychics to perform remote viewing, or by propagating a hologram that was so dense that information regarding what was going on at distant locations streamed into the laboratory. In other words, you simulated a hologram of something going on at another location, sometimes just in space, but also sometimes with a dislocation in time, all the way to physically sending somebody to a past or future event to gather information there. For example, to gather an artifact there and bring it back to the present. All of that was operational by the time I left the program in 1972.
So you're saying that people can travel in time and literally bring back material, artifacts, or whatever from another time period?
Absolutely. In fact, when I was a child attached to Project Pegasus, some of the future events in my life were shared with me because they had been gathered as intelligence findings from the future, and also specific artifacts. Books that I would write or edit, for example, were in the possession of Project personnel, including my father. And
you've seen this stuff. I mean, you were actually presented with things that you were going to do in the future?
There was a discussion. There were a number of discussions of things that I would be involved in the future, such as my discovery of life on Mars in 2008. Let me give you an example. In 1971, I was 9 going on 10. I turned 10 in September of 71. That year, I had a very bad case of bronchitis. And we had a sick room. Basically, we would use the guest bedroom of our house in New Jersey as the room that the kids in my family we would recuperate in. As I was basically recuperating almost over that illness, my dad came into that room and removed a writing, basically a paper, from an envelope. And he showed it to me. And it was a paper entitled The Discovery of Life on Mars. And my dad pointed to my name and the copyright date, which was 2008. And he said, son, how old are you going to be in 2008? And I said, 47. Of course, I was one of the whiz kids in Pegasus, so the arithmetic was pretty easy to do. And he said, yes, 47. So, son, let me explain that the purpose of this exercise is I simply want you to read this paper, look at all the photographs, and try to remember as much of the text and the photos as you can. And I said, why, Dad? Why is this necessary? And he said, because when you're 47, you're going to write and publish this paper. So what I'm saying, Christie, is, now that I've released The Discovery of Life on Mars, which is a work of original authorship, I researched it, I wrote it last year, and we published it on December 12th of 2008. But 37 years before that, a physical copy of that paper was in the possession of a Defense Department engineer, namely my dear old dad. And I was permitted to read a work that I would write in the future. Now, that's the kind of quantum access capability that the American government has had for the last 40 years. And I consider it my patriotic duty to inform the people of the United States of this fact now that we know that quantum access is affecting things as significant as our selection of the president. Now, why do I say that? I say that because I know, based on personal contact with George W. Bush and Barack Obama, that both of them were apprised of the fact that they were going to become president years in advance of the time that they ran for president and won their respective party nominations and were elected president of the United States. I also know, based on my service in Project Pegasus, that the future presidency of a young man named Bill Clinton was widely spoken of among the project engineers and scientists and federal science administrators, because the people attached to this basically what was an intelligence project were preparing and sharing reports of the information about the future that was being gathered by the project, being gathered by psychics, being gathered by people observing what was going on in the holograms being propagated by the chronovisors, and by sending U.S. intelligence personnel to past and future events and returning them safely to the present. So part of the backstory, I look at my release of all of this Mars data that establishes that Mars is an inhabited planet. For the last 6 months, I found myself fighting the battle of whether or not people believe that Mars is inhabited. And at this point, how much information do I have to publish? I mean, I've published substantial evidence, dozens of photographs of humanoid beings, animal species, carved statues, built structures that show that Mars has been inhabited since ancient times and that it is inhabited today. But that's only one degree of separation from reality in terms of what the public understands is reality. The sad fact is that they're in fact 2 steps removed from reality, because after announcing this information, after releasing this information, how do I then tell the people the truth? That the very paper I published in 2008 is a writing of mine written in 2008 that nonetheless I was permitted to read in 1971. That's so far out that it simply doesn't pass the giggle test. But the problem is, it's the true backstory of my discovery of life on Mars as we published in 2008, as we described it.
Okay, so, I mean, if in fact life exists, you didn't actually discover it in January 08. I mean, you traveled there as a young boy, right?
No, there was, rather, I was living my real-time existence as a kid, and a document that had been recovered from the future was something that I was shown and permitted to read. So in that instance, I didn't travel to the future to retrieve or read the paper. I was shown the paper after it had been retrieved by project personnel.
Okay. Wow.
And that allowed me essentially to read something I hadn't written yet. And that created a sort of a quantum interpolation where the data was considered so significant. In fact, it was considered transformative. We know that in the fullness of time, my claim that Mars is inhabited is going to be proved to a moral, a legal, a scientific certainty. I've already been briefed on that by the U.S. government. But the strange quantum access-based interpolation in the story is that after my paper was written in December of 08, at some point after that, it was brought back to 1971 because I was permitted to read it. Not a version that had been written by somebody else, but my version with the same text and photographs and everything. In fact, as I was writing the paper, researching it, composing the photographic details that I've extracted from NASA's photographs PIA 10214 and PIA 11049.
You know, I was just going to ask you that because I pulled out a quote where you say definitively, NASA JPL photograph PIA 10214 is going to spark a second Copernican revolution on our planet, and it was my cosmic privilege to discover that it contained evidence of life on Mars. Society will be transformed, I think, for the better, by the revelation of the fact that we are not alone in the universe, indeed, that we are not even alone in our own solar system. Would you please elaborate on that?
Well, essentially, we've lived since antiquity with the belief, the rather conceited belief, that Earth is the only inhabited planet in our solar system. And certainly, even though Aristarchus of Samos in ancient Greece had discovered the fact that the Earth rotates around the sun, when that fact was rediscovered by Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, in the 1400s, that idea was very controversial because it suggested that human life and life on Earth was not at the center of the cosmos, that it existed in relationship to a central sun, and that sun in turn was part of a vast galaxy. But nonetheless, since Copernicus and our ultimate acceptance of that truth, we've lived with the sort of the unscientific belief that none of the other planets are inhabited. Now, the reason that I believe that my discovery of life on Mars is going to have a transformative impact is simply that fact. We're now forced to confront the fact that we're not the only inhabitants of an inhabited planet in our own solar system. And the complications of that and the implications of that are things that we haven't even contemplated, much less publicly discussed. So in light of the fact that this discovery and my relationship to it had been uncovered by Project Pegasus in its time-space exploration in the early 70s, there was a decision that was apparently made, I assume at a fairly high level, to permit my father to literally allow me to read the paper that I would write in the future. So the irony sort of is that we already entered the time-space age 40 years ago, and now we're finally getting a handle on the actual scientific foundation of the space age, which includes the unpleasant fact that Mars, the planet that every 2 years is the planet that comes closest to Earth, is an inhabited sphere, just as the Earth is. It's very different from Earth. The ecosystem there is very fragile and certainly is vulnerable to visits by humans from our planet. There's not a robust biosphere there as there is on Earth, but there is humanoid and animal life there and things like running water. And I know in the fullness of time that the rather heretical claim I make in my writings that that's the truth will be proved and generally accepted by society. So I'm not very concerned about the avalanche of criticism I've been receiving.
Well, yeah, tell us about what kind of reaction have you got from your colleagues?
Well, I've gotten some very encouraging remarks from colleagues and individuals that I've met at some of my talks and so forth. But I think I've also received a lot of unfair criticism. I think a lot of what I've been called is consistent with the debunking that was called for in the CIA's Robertson panel of 1953. For example, I've been called a lunatic and a drug addict. Even though I earned 5 post-secondary degrees, I studied environmental law and policy at Cambridge. I'm a UCLA grad. I'm a Juris Doctor. My writings in environmental law and policy have been well received internationally. They've been library deposited. I've edited some significant works in exopolitics. I mean, I really received a barrage of criticism, none of which really goes to the condign evidence that I include in my papers. And so, nonetheless, I'm just letting this roll off my back because I know the ultimate way in which this controversy is going to be resolved, and that is going to be with a U.S. presidential recognition that Mars is inhabited.
Wow. Okay. Do we know who this president is?
I'd have to say he's one of my contemporaries, Barack Obama, who was born in August of 61. I was born in September of 1961. I met Barack Obama when I was a student at UCLA. He was out in L.A. Visiting some. He was had done a year at Columbia under the tutelage of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had just been National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter. And I met Barack Obama when he was in L.A. Visiting some of his friends from Occidental College. We had a mutual friend.
Andrew, we're rolling into break right now. Please hold that thought. You're with Barack at Occidental College. You're listening to Truth Brigade Radio with Andrew Basiago. Stay tuned. You're listening to Truth Brigade Radio on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. If you want to join us for the text chat, head over to TruthBrigade.com and check out some of these links. One of them we're going to be talking about tonight is exopolitics.com. Exopolitics.com, our special guest tonight, Andrew Basiago. Okay, before we went to the break, you were telling us about the Manchurian candidate you met at Occidental College. I'm sorry, I mean our president.
Well, yeah, we had a mutual friend in the movement that was seeking divestment by the University of California from South Africa. At that time, Barack Obama was active in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa. So we were introduced actually in somebody's kitchen in West Los Angeles, in the West Los Angeles apartment. And we had a discussion of about a half hour about different issues in political economy, what the significance of the transnational corporations was going to be during our lifetimes and so forth. But something very curious happened in 2008, which is that this contemporary of mine was elected president of the United States, and I discovered life on Mars. And when I think back about the young man that I met, how intelligent he was, how positive he was, how articulate he was, and when I consider the campaign for president that he ran so ably and well, and how he positions himself as a change agent, I have faith in Barack Obama's integrity as a human being and as a leader.
Ouch, Andrew, I like you too much to go there on this show. I'm sorry. Well, no,
at least to the extent that I think he'll recognize what his administration will achieve by acknowledging my finding that Mars is inhabited. First, I think that they'll recognize that it will heal a significant rift, and that would be the rift between Earth and Mars that followed the solar system catastrophe of 9500 BC, when the civilization that linked Earth and Mars was devastated by a cataclysmic event in our solar system. I think in present terms, the Obama administration will recognize that if we tell the people of the world the truth, that Mars is an inhabited planet, that will promote American leadership in the exploration of space, and also surface a set of public policy issues that we now have to consider in light of the fact that the United States and Russia are planning manned missions to Mars, politely ignoring the fact that...
Well, I know the Disclosure Project, and a lot of people have faith that, you know, he promised a transparent administration and all. But, okay, let's say, so you really think he's just going to come out and say, hi, we've been lying to you for the past 40 years, and now this is just, I mean, do you really think that's going to happen?
Yes, I don't think he has to say that, you know, the United States government has been lying to people for 40 years. I think all he has to do is stand tall with me in the Rose Garden or the East Room of the White House and announce the truth, which is that American space scientists working for NASA recovered images from the surface of Mars, that a trial lawyer from Washington State had the cosmic privilege of finding life in, and that he, as the leader of the executive branch of our government, is announcing that fact and will be attempting to lead the public policy discussion that now has to be held about the significance of that fact. Because it's not just the United States that is going to be visiting Mars. You know, as distinguished a space scientist as astronaut Buzz Aldrin has called for human settlement of Mars. And we have manned missions by the United States and Russia already planned. Any of the other spacefaring nations, to include China, Japan, India, the European Union, will ultimately attempt to send astronauts to Mars. And yet, we haven't even discussed the fact that Mars is inhabited, and there are a host of considerations that we have to take into account before placing human beings on the surface of Mars. Mars doesn't belong to the people of the Earth. It belongs to the Martians. And I'm hopeful that Barack Obama will recognize the significance of that and do the right thing and work with me to bring this fact to the people of the world and foster American leadership in space by doing so. I think he'll also be drawn to the fact that, you know, Alfred Lambermont Weber and I, the distinguished public international lawyer who has graciously agreed to serve as the chairman of my organization, the Mars Anomaly Research Society, we're promoting the idea that the ecology of Mars should be protected just like the ecology of planet Earth under the precautionary principle. And that's where you don't take actions where you don't know the outcome of those actions on the environment and on the species in a particular ecosystem. We're also calling for the application of the Prime Directive to the civilization of Mars, and that is one principally of non-interference with the development of Martian affairs. I think that Barack Obama will decide to make an historic announcement about the fact that Mars is inhabited, because he knows that in the process he'll do much to protect future generations, not just of Earthlings, but of Martians, by extending the international environmental laws and policies that we've developed to protect ecosystems on Earth for the first time to another planet, namely the planet Mars. And I think as an international lawyer, he'll recognize the significance of that, and I think as the leader of the free world, he'll decide to embody real change and stand tall with me and make this announcement. In fact, I can already see it.
Okay. Well, is this going to happen in his first term?
I believe that the overwhelming amount of evidence that I've already released and that I will continue to release, and that others are beginning to analyze and realize, clearly show that Mars is an inhabited planet, will make a presidential announcement by Barack Obama that Mars is an inhabited planet inevitable during his first administration.
Wow, that's a bold statement. You heard it here on Truth Brigade Radio. It is that time where we'll break, but we will be back on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Our special guest tonight, Andrew Basiago. You can find his work at exopolitics.com. Andrew, we have a real short segment here, but I want to ask you this. I mean, okay, so unequivocally, Barack Obama is going to announce life on Mars, and, you know, I think that's cool. I hope he does. And, you know, I guess time will tell. But let's just say that he does. Let's just say he announced it on the evening news tonight. We just missed it. Now what? What does that mean for us?
Well, that means that we're going to have to reformulate our worldview. I mean, it's going to work a paradigm shift. We're going to recognize that, look, if Mars is inhabited and the Earth is, that life as we understand it as existing on Earth may be fairly commonplace in the universe. We in fact, inhabit an inhabited cosmos, and that brings with it a special responsibility to protect the planets we're visiting, because they don't belong to us. They belong to the human and animal creatures that have evolved there. I think on the political level, it'll force greater collaboration between the space agencies of the different nations that are already spacefaring nations. If we're going to emerge into a spacefaring civilization, we're going to have to start asking first principle type questions about what we're doing. I mean, we're already landing robotic craft on Mars in big balloon-like constructions that pummel the surface until the object stops and the balloons pop, and then the rover is extruded on the planet of Mars and goes about the process of exploring the surface. We never asked whether that was an appropriate thing to do. Something like that could provoke, for example, interplanetary warfare. So clearly the national security of the United States, and indeed the security of the people of planet Earth, involves going about the process of space exploration in a more responsible way.
If it is inhabited, what do you think the Martians feel about our satellites and rovers and things landing on their planet? Why aren't they shooting them out of the sky like we did in Roswell?
Well, the remote viewing evidence indicates, and also, by the way, after my paper was published, I had a confirmation by a career CIA official that there's a humanoid civilization with several different types of humanoids that numbers about a million individuals, that is living primarily under the surface of Mars, and that is about 150 years more advanced than our own civilization here on Earth, and that is primarily nonviolent. So, in answer to your question, I believe the Martians are quite alarmed by finding that we're dropping these robotic craft on their planet. In fact, after I sat back and analyzed all the ample evidence in these two photographs, PIA 10214, which is a westward view of the Columbia Basin of Mars taken from the home plate plateau, and then 11049, which shows a southward view of that same plateau. When I looked at all the abundant evidence that clearly demonstrated the different humanoid life forms on Mars, the various animal life forms, some of which exist on Earth or once existed on Earth but are extinct or have never existed on Earth, and then the different forms of exquisite statuary that the Martians have carved, I began to suspect that maybe the discovery of life on Mars was an educational scenario that the Martians themselves had propagated. And by that I mean they knew we were landing craft there that would be beaming photographs back to Earth.
Okay, Andrew, hold that thought. Let's pick this back up on the other side. A short break here. Truth Brigade Radio. Truth Brigade Radio on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. If you want to join us in the text chat, head over to TruthBrigade.com. And the number to call tonight is 512-879-3805. Our special guest, Andrew Basiago. Andrew. So you believe that they know that we're there taking pictures and they're alarmed. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, we know that several of the humanoid species that are depicted in these photographs and a number of the animals are aware of the rover's presence on the surface of their planet because they're looking over at the rover. And in fact, many of the creatures, I should say, are depicted, were photographed looking at the rover. Apparently the rover emits a laser and some sounds that actually attract the interest of animals in the environment, creatures in the environment, and that was in fact engineered into the rovers to startle creatures in potentially inhabited ecosystems to actually look over and be photographed on the rover. But I'm actually describing something more subtle than that, and that is, after spending literally hundreds of hours analyzing these photographs, it was clear to me that we could say a number of things about the data of the life in them, the life forms and ancient artifacts in them. And that is that.
Let's talk about that, Andrew. But we do have a caller, and I would like for everyone to go to exopolitics.com, and we could actually look at these photos with you as you're explaining them. But let's take the caller before we start going into that and then get sidetracked. So it looks like our friend Louie B. Welcome to the show.
Hi.
Hey, Louie. How you doing?
Hi. So I actually have a question. Did a little Google search. You know who Professor Michio Kaku is? Hello.
I believe the caller is referring to Professor Michio Kaku?
Okay. Yeah.
He's a physicist at City University of New York.
Yes, that's correct. He says that the way they were only able to teleport photons of atoms of cesium and beryllium, and also, but the way it works is it would the machine would actually destroy it and then make a copy on the other side. So basically, they haven't been able to do it with DNA yet, but in order for it to work, it essentially would kill the person and make a copy on the other side. And my question is, how were you able to keep the original person?
Well, I know of Michio Kaku. In fact, curious irony is that I met him around the same time that I met Barack Obama when I was a UCLA student in the early 80s. At that time, Michio was active in the anti-nuclear energy movement. And I was introduced to him in Los Angeles. He's a wonderful human being. But he's a theoretical physicist, and in fact, he has not had access to the Defense Department's secret files regarding its advanced applications in quantum physics. This is one of the conceits of the theoretical physicists. They state that what they're talking about is at the cutting edge of applied quantum physics, for example, notions of time travel, of teleportation. But because of official state secrecy, they don't have access to the U.S. government's experiments in that realm. And so he's framed a number of theoretical concepts, for example, the notion that our reality has 10 dimensions, that simply do not correspond to the experiences that I had in Project Pegasus as a child. Now, I'm a lawyer, not a physicist, so I can't explain to you with the erudition of a physicist how we were teleporting. But all I can confirm is that we were jumping through a device, that this device generated a form of energy that Nikola Tesla found the means to extract from the universe, and that among the properties of this energy was the propensity to bend the fabric of time-space. So, as I mentioned earlier, we weren't being disintegrated and then reintegrated when we arrived in New Mexico. We were passing through a tunnel that had been opened up in the fabric of time-space. We know, for example, that space is incredibly dense. In fact, the ergs of energy that are just in what is supposedly vacuous space are astronomically high. They're almost incomprehensible how dense space is and how much energy is stored in it. But this energy that Tesla found a way to focus sort of sliced open a tunnel, and we were simply passing through it. So all I can say as a non-physicist is that while I have great respect for Michio Kaku as a scientist and as a person, the conceptions that you've just shared, that he's publicized, don't correspond to where the U.S. Defense Department was in applied quantum physics over 40 years ago.
Okay. So you're saying that that problem is killing the human during teleportation to create a copy that's been solved, basically, or it was never really a problem?
Well, he's conflated, essentially, Tesla-based teleportation with quantum teleportation. There's been a lot of recent literature about quantum teleportation, which is about basically finding a way to disintegrate something down to the subatomic level and then transmit it energetically and then reassemble it at its destination. All I can say is that's not what was going on in the project. They were opening up a time tunnel, if you will. I mean, there was a popular TV show at that time. It didn't look like that at all. It was just an energy effect. They were essentially slicing open an interstitial chasm in the fabric of time-space, and we were passing through it. And that is in fact, how teleportation was evolving beginning around 1970 in Defense Department. No, in classified research and development activities undertaken by the U.S. Defense Department. And at the same time, notions of teleportation were being dropped into popular science fiction like Star Trek that described a completely opposite effect, which is where somebody is disintegrated and then reintegrated at the destination. And I believe that was done to confuse people about the teleportation capability that was then operational.
So basically, I mean, if I could, like, pretty much dumb it down, you guys created a Stargate.
In fact, the term Stargate was being used in regard to one of the devices in the program. That was a device that permitted physical time travel to very distant locations in the past or future. In other words, many years. Okay? Mm-hmm. The basic device was called a teleport, and essentially, yes, it was creating a Stargate effect. An interstitial tunnel, a wormhole, if you will, was being opened up in the fabric of time-space. I have resisted the temptation to call it a wormhole because it was a perfectly circular tunnel. It didn't twist or anything. It just went straight forward. And as the space at the end of it emerged and we got closer and closer to the destination, the light suddenly came rushing at us, just as if you were speeding through the Lincoln Tunnel at 1,000 miles per hour. So they were simply opening a tunnel in time-space, and we were passing through it uninjured. Although I mentioned the one incident, unfortunately, where the young man lost his feet because he arrived standing in water. So there were issues of the specific density of different media that we might find at the destination. And that's, I believe, one of the reasons why this form of teleportation may not have been introduced in the civilian sector, is because there were complications regarding bodies of water and other things that might affect the time traveler when they were reaching the destination. I think what I can add to the debate is what I was told during my training and what I experienced when we were teleporting, which is that they were simply opening up a tunnel and we were passing through it.
Wow. Well, Louis, did you get your questions answered?
Oh, actually, no, one other question. When you came to Mars, did you happen to ask them how to make my pot more potent?
Louis. Okay. All right, you got your little jab in. I do want to let you know, though, you did mention you'd like to understand more of the mechanics, and we are having a PhD physicist come on the show Wednesday night who has written about these things in the research, so maybe Wednesday night he'll be able to answer that aspect.
All right, cool.
All right, well, thanks for your call. Okay, Andrew, well, let's get to this photo you've mentioned. Now, if you're just tuning in, head over to exopolitics.com, and then you're going to see a link, Life Discovered on Mars. Is that what we click on, Andrew?
Yeah, Alfred Weber has posted my original research paper that was published back in December 2008, which is entitled The Discovery of Life on Mars. And that's the first work to prove that Mars is an inhabited planet. And then he's also published the later research monographs that I've been writing as I make more and more discoveries of evidence that clearly shows that Mars has been inhabited for a long time and indeed is inhabited today.
Okay. Now, which one, you were going to show us some pictures here. Which PDF do we click on?
Well, really any of them, but I mean, I would encourage listeners to first click on the one entitled The Discovery of Life on Mars, and read the paper, because
Okay.
the paper really embodies the breakthrough. And the reason that I'm essentially taking credit for discovering life on Mars is not to suggest that others haven't speculated that Mars is inhabited, or that other individuals haven't made very significant contributions in terms of finding evidence that suggests that Mars is inhabited. But after careful analysis of the paper, Alfred Weber and I concluded that it really is the first work in science or literature to prove that Mars is inhabited. And so by stating that I've discovered life on Mars, it's really a semantic difference. What I mean is that this work is the first work to analyze photographs from Mars and include supporting text that shows that Mars is inhabited.
Okay, now you say it's been inhabited for quite some time. How long do you think life on Mars has existed?
Well, there are Egyptian ruins on Mars. For example, right on the cliff immediately in front of the rover Spirit is an object that is, it's a statue laying on its back on the cliff that we're calling the sarcophagus of the king. And that object is wearing a conical headdress that is identical to the headdress worn by Queen Nefertiti in the iconic bust of her that the German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt found at Amarna, Egypt in 1912. And so that object alone establishes a connection between ancient Egypt and ancient Mars. We know that that civilization was essentially destroyed, that great maritime civilization that Plato calls, that it refers to as Atlantis, was destroyed around 9500 BC. That was the civilization that, for example, built the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. We know that the passageway to the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid focuses on the planet Mars every year on the same day. In fact, it renders a red circle from the red planet on the wall within the King's Chamber on the same day every year. So we know when we look at these archaeological ruins that we've now found on Mars that there was a cultural connection between the civilization of ancient Egypt and the ancient civilization on Mars. So we know at least that the ruins date to as ancient as, or as long ago rather, as 9500 BC. Human civilization on Earth wouldn't begin again until around 3000 BC in ancient Sumer. So that's one of the first clues. The photographs show this linkage between ancient Egypt and ancient Mars. So we can assume that some of the statuary and the built structures that we find, for example, in PIA 10214, are from that great Egyptian epoch. My theory, I mean, we could ask whether Mars was a colony of Earth or vice versa. Having considered the abundant life on Earth and then the much more fragile and superficial evidence of civilization on Mars, I believe that Mars was probably a colony of Earth rather than the other way around. And
wow.
That colonial outpost got separated from us as a result of that solar system catastrophe in 9500 BC that probably resulted when debris elements from the Vela supernova explosion came into our solar system and devastated Mars, fractured Mars, squished it into an oblate spheroid, deposited boulders all over the surface of Mars, and did severe damage to Earth as well, ending that great maritime civilization. And so I think that, but we can't blithely assume that everything we find in the photograph was laid down there in a natural way. Before we went to the break, I was describing how when you consider all of the life forms and the ancient artifacts that we find in these photographs, and we consider how abundant the evidence is, and yet how esoteric and diverse it is, I don't think we can discount the possibility that everything we see in the photographs that shows that Mars is inhabited is kind of an educational scenario that maybe was propagated by the Martians themselves to inform us about Mars' present condition and some of its history now that we're sending explorers there.
Wow. Now let me ask you this. Do you think that maybe we are being visited by Martians?
Well, I know from my experiences in Project Pegasus around 1970 that one group of advanced intelligent humanoids from Mars has been in liaison with the United States government. There was an incident in which my father and I drove, again, to Curtis Wright in around 1970, and we went into a hangar there, and there was a concrete platform, kind of like a loading dock, and 3 Martian astronauts who had been in liaison with our Air Force and some of our aerospace engineers there at Curtis Wright walked out of the meeting, and they turned to my dad and said, well, it was nice seeing you again, Ray. While we were visiting your beautiful planet, thank you for introducing us to your son, Andrew. I hope that we can meet again. And then they got into their ship and then hovered across the tarmac, circled once, and then took off at a great rate of speed. And during that encounter, on the way over to Curtis Wright from our home in Morris Plains, New Jersey, I had been asking my dad, what do you mean we're going to be going over to Curtis Wright and meeting some Martians? And he said, Martians, son, human beings like us, except they're from Mars. And so that introduced me to the fact that there are intelligent humanoids on Mars that during the 1970-71 time frame were actually in liaison with our Defense Department. My dad mentioned a number of things about them that were kind of strange. I remember one thing that he mentioned.
Andrew, it's that time again, so please hold that thought. We're going to take a quick break here. We'll be right back on Truth Brigade Radio. All right, welcome back. You're listening to Truth Brigade Radio on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. Our special guest tonight, Andrew Basiago from Exopolitics.com. I mean, wow, just fascinating stuff. If you have any questions, feel free to give us a call, 512-879-3805. Andrew, if you would, please continue where we got cut off for the break.
Right. I was mentioning that in around 1970, my father took me over to Curtis Wright in Woodridge, New Jersey. And that was for the purpose of meeting these 3 Martians who had been consulting with our government and were going to be leaving. And on the way over, I really couldn't get my head around the fact that he was talking about, Martians. And I said, what do you mean, Dad, Martians? And he said, he got exasperated with me, and he said, human beings like us, son, except they're from Mars. And so when we arrived there, they were leaving. They were walking out of kind of an office setting there across the concrete platform of a loading dock-like area. And at the edge of that loading dock, their ship was hovering, basically about 4 feet off the ground. It was sort of a silver teardrop-shaped craft. And the 3 of them were walking in line, and the last one turned and in a rather high-pitched voice conversed with my dad as if he knew who my father was and had consulted my dad as an aerospace engineer who had worked on a number of top U.S. classified aerospace projects, including the Ramjet engine at Curtis Wright beginning in 1952 and the B-70, which was the atomic-equipped strategic bomber that the Air Force began working on in the 1950s. And so as we were driving home, I asked my dad a number of questions about the Martians, and a few of the things I remember is, one thing he said is that the Martian that spoke to us, his voice was so high because their vocal cords had evolved, or at least been living for thousands of years in an atmosphere that was substantially different from our own. Our own atmosphere had much more oxygen, so that when the Martian spoke, he spoke in a very high-pitched tone. Another thing that he mentioned that I haven't really made sense of until recently, around the time that I wrote my paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, is he said that the behavioral scientists working for the U.S. government had determined that when the Martians would land on our planet or be in liaison with our scientists, they would spend a lot of time scrutinizing natural evidence, like let's say 3 or 4 leaves that were piled up out in the woods. And my dad explained we really didn't understand why they spent so much time trying to divine the truth of natural patterns that they found in evidence as commonplace as a stack of leaves that you might come upon in the woods. And I now realize that if you look at the evidence of essentially the biosphere on Mars, it's clearly a fragile post-collapse ecosystem. So humanoid life forms that would struggle to survive there would have to be very attuned to their environment in the same way that, let's say, Australian Aborigines are on Earth. And so I've now kind of completed that circle and realized that this particular group of Martian humanoids were very astute students of natural evidence, because such a skill would be necessary to survive on a planet where there's essentially a collapsed ecosystem. I remember he said that in Martian mathematics, 2 + 2 = 5, which I think is a way of saying that they had more of a geometric form of mathematics, which would certainly be of relevance to a humanoid civilization that had to build many underground structures either before or after this cataclysm that we now know occurred around 9500 BC. So I've now just recently been able to make sense of some of the things about this humanoid civilization on Mars that my dad shared some basic facts about. But they were relatively ordinary looking. From the perspective of a 9-year-old kid from New Jersey, around 1970, I thought they kind of looked like the Three Stooges, but they were bald. But they certainly looked unusual, sort of like not particularly handsome Caucasian, bald males would on Earth. I think if they walked down the street in New York City in human clothing, they would not be detected as being from another planet. But indeed they were. And when the ship took off, it was just really amazing to watch, because when it reached a critical velocity, it was still going horizontal. It just took off at a supersonic speed that I know from my dad's work for the Air Force and the Navy we had not yet accomplished. Perhaps they were there consulting with the U.S. Air Force about projects like what ultimately became the Aurora project, because I know that the Martians that were leaving left in a craft that took off at an incredible rate of speed.
Wow.
I would say thousands of miles per hour. It was not a flying saucer, and it did not begin spinning and leave in some superluminal way. It was a conventional craft that took off at initially hundreds and then thousands of miles per hour as it screamed across the tarmac there at Curtiss Wright and then shot off into the sky. But they were very polite. They looked very human.
So
I was not...
Martians or people on Mars look just like us?
There is one type of humanoid on Mars that looks virtually identical to modern humans. They're much less hirsute than us. They're either bald or in adulthood have only small patches of hair on their head. That just genetically seems to be their endowment. They are probably actually long-lost cousins of ours that clearly haven't been procreating with humans on Earth for 10,000 years, but that probably could. There are groups on Earth that haven't procreated for thousands of years because of geographic distances. Let's say somebody from Europe and somebody from China or Africa or what have you. And so they're probably literally modern Homo sapiens that are simply separated by the 9,500 or now 11,500 years of distance that we have from that great cataclysm that fractured Mars and devastated Earth and basically put an end to that interplanetary civilization.
So you met Martians?
Yes, I met human beings from Mars.
Do you think they're just walking around amongst us, living just like us?
That's something that I wouldn't offer an opinion of. Dr. Courtney Brown has alleged that there are colonies of Martians in New Mexico, in South America. That's something that I have no first-person knowledge of. I can say that these three individuals were clearly from Mars because my father was insisting that they were, and they were humanoids just like us. He said, human beings from Mars. So I believe they were literally not just genetically related to us because their DNA was placed on Mars where it independently evolved. I believe they were literally modern human beings who were simply separated from our gene pool by the 11,500 years of time that's passed since that great cataclysm. They were basically our long-lost relatives that were back in communication with Earthlings, visiting us in advanced craft and clearly cooperating there with the U.S. Air Force and Defense Department officials there at Curtiss Wright.
Okay. Well, a lot of people do think that aliens are among us, and I mean, I'm sure you've seen the movie They Live and other pieces similar. It's something to ponder. That'd be. I want to meet a Martian. I mean, why aren't these UFOs landing in my yard? I've got plenty of space. I mean, they literally go unnoticed.
Well, actually, that's apropos what may have been going on. We have a human-dominated civilization on Earth. We know from this encounter that my dad and I had at Curtis Wright around 1970. I don't know the specific time. It was 1969, 1970 time frame. We know that the U.S. government was then in liaison with a very human type of being on Mars. What we know from the literature of alien abduction, however, is that the creatures that have been entering people's lives and abducting them and performing medical experimentation and so forth may very well be from distant star systems and clearly seem much more evolved than the very human-looking creatures from Mars that I met at Curtis Wright. So one possibility is that the U.S. government and the Martian civilization was in liaison to establish a regime of terrestrial security protecting both planets from extraterrestrial incursion. I know, for example, that there's a link between Curtis Wright and the aerospace projects that followed the July 1952 overflight of our nation's capital by 9 extraterrestrial craft that were clocked by Langley Air Force Base at traveling over 7,000 miles per hour. So one possibility, it's a speculation on my part, but I think it's an intelligent one, is that by 1970, the U.S. government, on behalf of the citizens of our planet and this advanced civilization on Mars, were in liaison to develop the technology to protect both planets from extraterrestrial aggression or interference. That certainly was the reason that my dad was ordered to report at Curtis Wright in October of 1952. He'd been working for for Okanite in Paramus, New Jersey, and received orders from the U.S. Army to report to Curtis Wright, and that was to work on the ramjet engine, which was a high-performance jet engine that would enable our craft to travel at supersonic speeds, both in the Earth atmosphere and the near-Earth space environment. So there was a link there between Curtis Wright and efforts by the U.S. Air Force to respond to the post-Roswell, post-1952 extraterrestrial security threat. And I'm just speculating, but I think that that's why the Martians may have been consulting our government as our allies, not as neutral visitors or as aggressors.
Okay. Well, remember the War of the Worlds. Do you think that little, I don't know, what should we call it, an experiment, might have something to do with why they're not just coming out with this in politics? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons why the U.S. government has not yet lifted the truth embargo on the fact that Mars is inhabited and that we've been in liaison with a species of advanced intelligent humanoids on Mars for over 40 years now. I think one of the reasons clearly is groupthink, and that is that people feel obligated to defend the establishment scientific view that life cannot and therefore must not exist on Mars. Another reason, of course, would be brainwashing. I mean, I think that the government disinformation that has been directed at my writings is simply an attempt to continue to brainwash the public that Mars is not an inhabited planet. There's also, of course, the fear factor. I think the discovery of life on Mars evokes fear of the new, the unknown, the strange, and obviously that which is possibly threatening. I think that there's clearly a phobic response to Mars that has resulted to Orson Welles' infamous 1938 broadcast of a dramatization of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds, which caused a mass panic event, and I think that has its lingering effects. But I think, there are other causes. I think that people have been conditioned through ufology and the belief that there will be a future contact event, to expect that that first contact event will, in a sense, forever remain an inevitable possibility that will never occur, and people are sort of being just kept on the edge of their seats, that there will ultimately be an event such as was dramatized in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, but then again, that event will never happen in their lifetimes. I think that people's religious worldviews sometimes present obstacles to them accepting the fact that Mars is inhabited. And I also think there's something that we might call catastrophobia. That's a term that was developed by the Mayan elder Barbara Hand Clow, and she believes that the solar system catastrophe in 9500 BC still causes an irrational phobic reaction to Mars that is almost sort of our genetic legacy or a profound cultural legacy, that we know something devastated civilization in the past and caused us to become separated from Mars. So when people speak about Mars or Martians today, it's often in a very phobic, fearful vein. And a lot of the literature and the science fiction about Mars and Martians has been in that negative vein. And I think that's tragic, because the evidence that I see in these photographs indicates that the Martians are very much like us. The animal species are very close to animals that presently exist on Earth or have existed on Earth. And I don't think ultimately that the life forms on Mars are something that we should be afraid of. But I do think
all right, Andrew, hold that thought. We're rolling into break right now, but we will be right back for the home stretch here on Truth Brigade Radio. You're listening to Truth Brigade Radio on AmericanFreedomRadio.com. The website, TruthBrigade.com, and this is the last segment with our special guest, Andrew Basiago. You can find a ton of his research at exopolitics.com and check out all of these pictures and evidence he's been talking about tonight. I want to thank you again for being here, Andrew. But if you would please continue, we have a few more minutes here.
Thank you very much, Christie. Well, I just want to say that, I've received a lot of criticism, but it's criticism that I welcome, because I recognize that this is a very substantial claim I'm making, a very serious claim. But I know in the fullness of time that my claim that Mars is inhabited will be proved. So because I'm confident that that's going to happen, I'm willing to endure the criticism and a lot of the resistance and resentment that the announcement of this discovery has engendered. I hope in the final analysis that we can determine what we should do about Mars and then explore Mars and make contact on Mars, the civilization there, in a spirit of human fellowship, not just among ourselves, but also with the Martians. My own conviction is that we're all children of God, and I think, in a sense, we must now become citizens of the cosmos, which is something we've never really been forced to do before. And I think my discovery is significant in the sense that, for the first time, human beings on Earth have beheld life on another planet. I mean, this is the contact event that was, in a sense, was dramatized in the feature film Contact, starring Jodie Foster. And while I think that we must look at Mars with the eyes of a child and appreciate the cosmic privilege that we have, that we're living in the generation where this discovery was made, and we can look at and contemplate life forms and ancient artifacts on another planet, I think we also have to accept the fact that, in a sense, we're leaving our cosmic childhood. I think that's where a lot of the fear is coming from. We're having to accept the fact that we live both in an awe-inspiring universe and also, in a sense, a terrifying one that we're being inevitably asked to explore and confront. So I'm hoping that we can do so in a spirit of human solidarity and do so with respect for each other and also those we encounter. As we make our journey onward and upward to the stars, because this is really a profound privilege that we have as individuals who have been born in and have come of age in the space age. And I hope we can look upon it with an incredible sense of excitement and also a sense, as I said, of cosmic privilege that, we're in the generation that in which this discovery has been made, in which more and more is going to be found out about what's on Mars. I mean, it's
well, I hope
adventure.
so. I mean, it really is just fascinating. It's mind-boggling, really. I would like to ask you this. You know, I mentioned War of the Worlds in the last one. I'd like to ask what you think about Project Bluebeam and what the purpose would be.
Well, I've read some articles about Project Bluebeam. I don't know much about it. I can certainly say, I mean, I can inform the discussion by saying that holography undertaken by the U.S. Defense Department was developed enough by 1970 to bring remote images of past and future events into the laboratory. So when we look at claims, for example, that holograms were used during the Second Gulf War to confuse the Iraqi forces to believe that there were literally thousands of tanks entering Baghdad, I don't think those claims can be readily dismissed, because the propagation of holograms was very developed 40 years ago. So if you are considering the notion that a hologram could be propagated on an international basis to confuse the inhabitants of Earth that the second coming of Jesus Christ is occurring, or that a mass flotilla of extraterrestrial spacecraft is circling the globe, my guess would be, based on my experiences in Project Pegasus, that technology is already operational. So I think we have to be cautious about any kind of mass event that occurs like that, and appreciate the fact that it may be a global psyop being propagated holographically. But I think this is an issue that you confront in all areas of technology. Virtually all technologies can be used for good or ill, and what's motivating me in finally speaking out about what Project Pegasus accomplished is I think we have to transform our transportation infrastructure and seriously explore implementing teleportation to move individuals between great distances on Earth, because we're simply using an antiquated technology in conventional aerospace designs like airplanes and so forth.
Well, we have about a minute left, but how safe is that? I mean, were there any accidents in your experience with the teleportation?
Well, the project was experimental and dangerous, and as I mentioned, one of the children popped into view in Santa Fe standing in 3 inches of water in a public fountain and literally slid off his feet at the ankles as if his ankles had been passed through a bandsaw. It was very traumatic for me to run past his location and see him there struggling on the ground after that grievous injury. So they still were working with the technology and seeing if they could standardize it and eliminate some of these risks. We were involved as children in the project for a number of reasons. We were clearly experimentees to see how kids would respond to such technologies. We were always medically examined and then cognitively tested after we would teleport to Santa Fe. We were also, in another sense, trainees, because they expected that we would be the next generation of chrononauts. So all technologies have risks. I mean, people lose their lives in plane crashes, but we still all readily get on planes because of the convenience of jumping from one point on Earth to another in a...
Of course, Andrew, we are out of time. I want to thank you again for being here and sharing all of your research with us. Once again, Andrew Basiago, the website is exopolitics.com. And thank you all for listening. Hope to see you tomorrow night here at Truth Brigade Radio.